address a mechanism for doing that work. We need to do the same thing again. And certainly research dollars would be important. The issue of metadata and data, free and open access to data, I can say honestly the progress has been slower than anyone anticipated. In Canada, we're probably ahead of the curve. Internationally, it's been very difficult. People use different standards. There's different types of protection, intellectual property protection of data in countries, and just the standards for sharing information vary a great deal. But we need a long-term commitment to that. And I'll talk in a minute about a project called Sustaining Arctic Observing Networks, or SAON, which is an Arctic Council endorsed project to try to accomplish some of those things. So we need to support existing efforts to make information available and share information, and we need to fill gaps where they exist. And this is not just for digital information, but for material that needs to be curated as well. DNA samples, ice cores, fossil driftwood, art, cultural material that needs to be preserved, oral records of stories. That's not the sort of thing that you just put into a website. So we need to think about that as well. And honestly, that hasn't been a large part of the data management conversation in IPY so far. In terms of training and education, I think we have been very successful, in part because there was funding for students and opportunities to train partners as part of these IPY activities. Early on, we had a proposal for youth steering committees, and youth steering committees sprang up in about 21 different countries, and they now coalesced into a group called Arctic Polar Early Career Scientists, or APEX. And this is an organization now that will support students and early career scientists who are interested in all aspects of polar sciences. Did I say Arctic? It should have been Association of Polar Early Career Scientists. In Canada, we've seen a number of focused activities through various student organizations, the Youth Steering Committee, Arctic Met Students Association, other university committees. They've taken on a time capsule project that's now coming to its completion. I think there's a call for proposals for pictures and stories and things like that to be included. And that time capsule will be in the Prince of Wales Heritage Centre here in Yellowknife for the next 50 years, or whenever the next IPY is, and then opened and shared with other students. The University of the Arctic and the International Antarctic Institute are bodies of international organizations of universities and colleges that have developed programs during IPY that are going to be intended to sustain training opportunities. For northern colleges and high schools, let's just talk about Canada, I think there's still a lot of work to do, but there have been some very fruitful discussions about how to sustain programs and make programs more accessible and to link those to other career opportunities. But there's more work to do there. And then outreach in schools. Next week in Winnipeg is the Canada-wide Science Fair. It's organized by the Youth Science Foundation. The Youth Science Foundation Canada is one of our very earliest partners in IPY in getting information about IPY science into 11,000 high school classrooms across the country. And so next week they'll be having special events for IPY science at the science fair, and also developing a website to share resources with teachers and students in the longer term. This is a place where we might be able, in fact, to put some of our outreach materials and make them accessible widely. We need these sorts of portals because teachers in particular don't have time to go and surf through thousands of websites to find relevant material. In terms of outreach and communications, there's been all sorts of public activities, stamps and coins and dog sled races and science center displays and websites and multimedia artists. Some of these are one-off events and some of them will be sustained, but we've certainly learned a lot from these activities. The messages of IPY, the international messages anyways are ones of melting snow and ice, of global connections between the poles and the rest of the planet, and of northern neighbors, and how people in the north are connected to the rest of the planet. But some of those messages need to have a little bit more detail, a little more meat attached. And that's going to be an ongoing part of rolling out of the IPY programs. We've always talked about a legacy. People always identified legacy from the very beginning of IPY. If we look back 50 years ago, one of the legacies of the geophysical year was new research infrastructure in the Arctic. During this IPY, we've seen new stations in Svalbard and the Antarctic. Various countries have committed resources to build new facilities. And in Canada, the front end of investment in new facilities is this Arctic Research Infrastructure Fund, the $85 million that were announced last month to enhance a fair number of facilities across Canada, as well as the planning for the High Arctic Station. Data and data management. There's a proposal right now from the Federal Program Office to expand the Polar Data Catalog. This is the metadata portal that we're using for IPY. But there's a request now for the 6 federal departments that are participating in IPY to put non-IPY Arctic data in there as well to make it more useful and to expand it. And this is linked to international efforts to develop what's being called a Polar Information Commons, or a place where all of this can be found. And again, as I said before, this has turned out to be an absolutely huge challenge. Not just to get the metadata, the records of data, but where do you put this stuff when you've got it? We're not anywhere close to that. Links between science and public policy, the governance of science and the organization of science internationally and in Canada is something that continues to need attention. And research dollars. I think we're going to have to be, again, creative and work as a community to find new funding sources. Organizations that have supported much of this work, the Canada Foundation for Climate and Atmospheric Sciences, NSERC, CIHR, CFI, NCEs, they do have funds, but not necessarily in the pots that we can use to access them. And I think we have to come together and look at creating new sources of funding. Governments do that, like they did with IPY, but we need to work together if we're going to as well as look at private sector and international opportunities. So what's next? And other people are thinking about this as well. When we first started talking about an international polar year in Canada, we had a few visits up north in 2003, 2004. People in community said, so where have you been for the last 50 years? Every year up here is a polar year. And I think that's really the attitude we need to have, is that these aren't events that occur twice a century or at long intervals. We need to think about how we sustain these efforts in the long term. There is a proposal from the International Meteorological Organization and a couple other bodies too, and this is being led by Russia in particular, to have an international polar decade. Part of an acknowledgement that 2 years is unlikely to be sufficient to answer many of the questions. We just started to build teams and put in place the monitoring and research programs that we need over the longer term. So maybe that's a possibility, a polar decade. We need something that gets the attention of governments, of people who would fund this work, let them buy into a project. We need to create something, because through just the normal sources, it won't be sufficient to do the work we want to do. We need to make sure that the societal benefits of research are more obvious, that it's of value to people who need that information for decision making or forecasting. So the predictive skill of our efforts needs to improve.